So one of the main strategies I use inside my trading tool belt is going to be supply and demand. Now, pretty much every trade I take, I'm using some sort of supply and demand, whether it's to get an entry or to get an exit on my actual trade. So that's why in this video, I'm gonna be giving you a full guide of exactly how I look at supply and demand, how I use it inside my trading, so hopefully you can do the same yourself. Now, before we get into the charts and show you some real examples of how to actually use supply and demand in your trading, right, let's talk about what supply and demand really is. So obviously this is just basic economics 101. Demand is basically where buyers are wanting to buy. This is where they have limit orders, right? This is the price they're looking to get filled at. And when price usually drops to that level, they have those limit orders set from previous price history that never got filled. And a lot of times that's where the demand comes in and picks up, and those orders will start getting filled. And same thing on the flip side with supply, right? They have a lot of sell limits, right? They want to sell at a certain price. Let's say that price was 400. They have their limit orders set on 400. So when price gets up to that level, right, that's where, a bunch of sellers come in, right? And this is basically supply is where sellers want to sell. And that's typically what makes the price start to drop because a lot of people are selling. Now, if we go into the actual charts here, this is the SPY chart. What you want to first look at is typically, the bigger the time frame, the higher probability the supply and demand will actually end up working, just because it usually has more weight, right? The bigger the time frame. So as we can see, right, you can see there's a clear demand level when we get down to this 355, right where this line is. Every time it comes down here, as you can see, buyers have all kinds of limit orders set and it gets bought up. And obviously the same thing happened again over here. And then if we go towards the top, right, this is more of the supply section. As we can see, we got up here to this price level and price immediately wicked down and started to sell off. Same thing happened again right here. Price wicked down, started to immediately sell off. Same thing happened up here again. And now we're starting to itch over to that price here. Now, let's say you wanted to take a day trade or you're looking to take a week-long swing trade, right? Price action isn't really in close to any of these levels. Okay, so now what we can do is we can start going into the smaller time frames. Again, there's going to be a little bit less probability that these trades will work because they're smaller time frames, but especially if you're day trading and you're looking to get, $1 or $2 moves on SPY, you still have a pretty good chance of these levels actually happening. So now I would go into the 1 hour chart, right? So let's check out the 1 hour chart, see what's going on here. As we can see, I want to see if you can kind of spot where the supply and demand levels right now in your head. Okay, so as we can see, kind of where my mouse is right here, this is clearly a demand zone, right? Every time we get to this 378, right, we come up. We can come down to here. We dropped a little bit below, but we started to wick up pretty fast here. We come and touch it again. We wick up. We come and touch it again. We wick up. We come and touch it again. We wick up. All right, same thing here. We had a huge push up here. So this is clearly a demand zone. Now, this is one mistake I see a lot of traders make, including myself when I first started, is, you think like, oh, it has to hit exactly this line. No, right? This is why we call it a zone. So what I usually do is I like to draw like a rectangle and kind of draw a zone of like where it could potentially bounce at. Okay, that's kind of what I want to see here. So that's the first thing you kind of got to do. Now, the next one we're looking at is the supply zone. Like, where is this supply zone? It was right here. Every time price came to this, mark, there's a bunch of sellers here. Came here, boom, sold off. Came here, sold off. Came here, sold off. Came here, sold off. It finally broke out of that level. So now when it breaks out of this level, this supply would now turn into demand. And you can clearly see what happened, right? We went up, right? So we broke out of that supply and we came back down exactly to that level. And as you can see, buyers bought it up. There's all kinds of demand there. So what supply and demand does is it really gives you a good idea of entry points, potential entry points that you want to take. Now, another supply zone I can see right here, if we're looking like just at the past couple days, some trades you could have taken over the past week or so, we can see, this is a pretty big supply zone right at this 393 level. You can see price came up to here and immediately had a huge sell-off. So anytime you see, really fast sell-offs when it comes to a level, that's another time where it has a higher probability of actually working the next time it comes to that level. Now, what we can see is, let's just go ahead and draw a line right here. As you can see, it kind of worked out in this level. So again, this used to be a demand zone, but once we broke it down and we finally came back up to it, what does it do? It always flip-flops, right? demand turns into supply and supply turns into demand once it breaks those actual levels. So we can see we broke down, now it turned into supply, as we can see, and then we ended up breaking out of it, right? Over the past week or so, we ended up breaking out of it, which means, right, what does that mean? Now it's another demand zone. So now we can go into the smaller time frame, right? I'm gonna go into the 5-minute chart, and I'm gonna scroll back here, and we can see, let's say you were trying to trade this day. It's really choppy price action this day. But if we look back here, let me kind of move my screen. We can see, again, price doesn't always work to a T, so this is where we draw a rectangle, right? So let's say we're looking at pre-market, we're thinking about taking a trade, we're trying to figure out what we're gonna do for that day. I believe this is the day after inflation data came out. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna draw a little rectangle around this kind of, was supply zone, now it's kind of turning into a demand zone. So I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller, and you can kind of see that's the zone that you would have been looking for potentially to buy in for calls if you're trading options for the price to go upward so you can make money. So now let me actually kind of zoom in here. We can see we have this zone marked, and what's even funnier is we got to this in the pre-market, right? Once we came down around to the zone, it immediately wicked up, which basically tells us that, buyers are buying it up fast when it got to that area, which tells me there's demand. Again, this isn't like magic stuff. It all comes down to what are buyers and sellers doing, right? That's all these candles and charts really are. It just tells you what buyers and sellers are doing, right? Which is supply and demand. This is why it's such an important concept in trading, and to really look at these levels and study it. So as we can see, when price sold off here and it came over to this demand zone that we would have been able to mark before the market even opened, just from this previous level back here, because when it got here, right, it sold off pretty fast, and that was the supply zone. After we broke out of it, right, it now turns into a demand zone, which is exactly what happened. We saw it in the pre-market. That gives us another confirmation that there was buyers stepping in. As you can see, we made this higher low, so immediately when we got this nice little doji candle, this would have been a great entry to actually take a starter position. Which brings me to the next topic of this video. Once you know how to actually draw the zones and you're able to identify them, right, the next step is how can you execute on the zones? And this is almost harder, in my opinion, to actually do this in real time and actually execute on the zone. So when it comes to executing on the zone, what I typically do is I like to start a half position. Okay, so typically when we see, a doji candle, that tells me that, basically what that means is buyers and sellers are kind of equal, right? Think of it as like a tug of war. Buyers are pulling this way, sellers are pulling this way. And when we got this close right in the middle, right, there's a very small body. There's two long tails. That tells me they're kind of even, right? Which tells me buyers could potentially hold this up, even though we had so much selling pressure. As you can see, sellers were winning like crazy down here, and then once we got to this demand zone, like we talked about, right, this is kind of where they equaled out. So what does that do? That gives us another confirmation that this trade could potentially work. It increases our probability. So this is where I would probably take my first position on this trade. And as we can see, right, the next candle, this is a 5-minute chart. The next candle had a very bullish close, right? As we can see, buyers won the majority of this candle. So this is where I'd potentially enter that, full position and add to my trade. And then as we can see, when we got up to this previous levels, I'd probably trim around here and hold a runner to wherever I'm thinking it's going next, which is probably where it originally opened, right? It literally came to where it originally opened to a T. Now, to show you another example of the same exact demand zone, so what I'm gonna do is we're just gonna go to the next day and I'm gonna extend this, right? I'm not gonna move it. I'm literally just going to extend this chart, or this box, I mean. So again, same demand zone. We can see this is clearly a demand zone again here. And today, so this is actually what happened today. As we can see, pre-market, we sold off straight into this demand zone, right? And not only that, but again, we made another higher low, which tells me buyers were eager to, buy this demand zone up. It was still intact, right? This demand zone was still intact. And as we can see, we immediately opened, right? And we started to trend up. we started to have a bunch of doji candles, which means they're kind of equal in the tug of war. And this is where on the open, you could potentially take a position and ride it back up to these pre-market levels where we originally were, where we closed yesterday and where we were during pre-market, right? That would have been a really nice trade. Obviously, there was some supply here, and then we eventually broke out of this the whole entire day. And for me, I don't really hold my trades the whole entire day, so that really wouldn't apply to me. I'm just looking for these, $1 or $2 moves inside this demand zone, and again, we want to find these supply and demand zones on the bigger time frames, like this 1 hour chart, because that tells me that there's going to be a higher probability of it actually working in your favor. Now, you might be wondering, well, Chad, that's great, but what would happen if this trade didn't work out, right? Where would you actually exit the trade? So let's go back to the 5-minute chart. And really for me, let's go back to this day, okay? So you can see we have this doji candle. So this means that this next candle opened right here. And again, I would wait for this candle to close. So I'm looking for a doji candle to have my first entry. Okay, so I'd wait for it to close. So that means price action opened right here. So what I would do is I would put my stop loss below this wick we got, because again, we saw we're making a higher low. Let me get rid of this. I would put my stop loss somewhere down here. Okay, so this would basically mean, let me pull up my trend line. So we entered around right here. This is and keep in mind, this is our first position, right? This is only a starter position. I usually start with a half position. So if you're trading with $5,000, I would start and add my first entry of $2,500. So this would mean we would basically risk, let's say 0.17%. Obviously options is more leverage, but whatever that equals out to in options, 0.17%. all the way up to, this pre-market level. I would take my first exit. I'm kind of looking at, that pre-market level right there, right, to a 0.64. So basically what that means is we're risking 0.17 to make 0.64. And this is where our first trim would be, and potentially get all the way up to, that 1. So that would average to around a 3-to-1 risk to reward ratio. That's typically what you want to keep your trades at when it comes to, actually knowing if you want to take your trade or not. You want to be able to risk, $100 to make 300. So no matter what, you only lose $100, and you could potentially gain $300 as long as you don't sell right away, right? This is why you want to let your trades actually run, so your winners are bigger than your losers, and really just focus on increasing your risk to reward ratio while looking at the supply and demand zones, while actually looking at price action, looking at these candles. You can also look at the volume. We had some increasing volume here, so that gives us, another little confirmation. So that's how I would actually go about executing the trade. All right, so just to recap this again, to kind of put everything together, kind of what I'm looking for when it comes to supply and demand zones. Again, looking at, for demand, where are buyers buying? So looking at previous price levels, looking at the bigger time frames, that's going to give you a higher probability for your supply and demand zones. The next thing you want to do is seeing if there's multiple confirmations for those demand zones. So that example I gave earlier, we can see that the pre-market immediately wicked up, and that told me that buyers stepped in. Another confirmation we had was that doji candle. That told me that, buyers and sellers were kind of in that equal tug of war, and price could potentially reverse and go back up to those previous supply levels. Okay, and another confirmation we had is those higher lows, right? We can see the pre-market made the low of 392.02, and as we can see, right when we got that doji candle, it started going up. That was a higher low. That told me buyers were really starting to step in into this demand zone. From there, price started to go up like crazy because all kinds of buyers were stepping in. So for you, when you're doing this and applying this to your own trading, first identify your zones, understand how to draw them, look at the higher time frames, and then when you're actually executing on the zones, right, it's real time, you're actually trading, you're getting ready, maybe you're paper trading, whatever it is, doesn't matter. This is where you want to look for multiple confirmations that this demand zone or supply zone will actually end up working out by looking at, stuff like the actual price action, the candles, the volume, multiple confirmations, the higher lows, all that different stuff is going to increase the probability of your trade. And the last step of this is actually looking for the exit, right? where are you going to exit, whether the trade goes in your favor or maybe it doesn't, right? Maybe the demand zone just didn't end up working out and you get stopped out. So knowing where you're actually going to stop out, don't just hold it forever, right, and hope it goes back up. You have to have a certain amount of money that you're willing to risk on that trade, and making sure that fits in with your 3-to-1 risk to reward ratio. If you're looking to make, potentially 300 on that trade, you're only going to risk around $100, and just making sure that risk reward is there. So anyways, guys, I hope this made sense. This is exactly what I use. This is my exact system I use when it comes to trading supply and demand zones. Hopefully this was helpful for you. If it was, all I ask you to drop a like on this video and subscribe if you're new. Let me know you want more videos like this. Also, if you guys want to learn exactly how I trade, the exact system I take, and kind of a little bit of this video recapped into a free guide, a free book, be sure to download a free copy of my Trading Boss guide. This will show you exactly how I day trade profitably in the stock market. Inside one of the chapters in there, I have my exact system. So this is kind of like the sheet I look at while I'm trading. So I kind of have a checklist I go through to see if I'm actually going to enter the trade or not. So again, if you want a free copy of this guide, all you have to do is go to the first link in the description below, or just go over to this link right here. So anyways, guys, with that being said, as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Trade smart, trade safe, and I will see you in my next video.